sense to me.
Well, it was.
Except to keep the jail's population down.
Well, that's part of it, is money. Money seems to be driving it, and that reminds me of someone who said, we know what it costs to lock people up in prison per year, but we don't know what it costs to leave these people out in the community. And they do. This methamphetamine in particular is a very destructive drug. It harms the whole fabric of families. And I guess the last component of this, as we're talking about it, is there's a national component to it, because as I understand it, 95% of the methamphetamine in the United States is coming from Mexico. And so they are able, because of the way the country is at this point.
Why are we not surprised?
Yeah, they produce basically pharmaceutical grade methamphetamine, and then they bring it up here in the truckload, and they're flooding our country with methamphetamine.
And they're cutting it now with fentanyl?
The fentanyl is usually cut, that's more of a heroin type of an additive.
Heroin?
Yeah, more that. Not to say that it couldn't be done, but the fentanyl analog is as deadly a substance as ever been produced by anyone. And I think a lot of that comes from China.
So China comes in on it. This is a worldwide
It is.
problem.
And so when you started the question, you said, well, is there a law that we could change that would make this problem go away? And so it's really
a big law.
Yeah, it's a complex situation that's multifaceted, and there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of things that need to be adjusted.
What can the Attorney General of South Dakota do then to help make citizens safer?
Okay. Well, specifically, that is the job of the Attorney General.
Yes.
Is to enforce the laws that the people of our state have passed that are designed to protect us from harm. And so that's the Attorney General's chief responsibility, is to lead the fight against crime and utilize the laws that have been passed to protect people. Now, the Attorney General also could put together what we used many years ago, and I've been prosecuting long enough that I remember that 15, 20 years ago, we used to have multi-jurisdictional drug task forces. And what they did, and I was a member of one here, it was Butte, Lawrence, and Meade County. So geographically, we have a lot in common. And they did this across the state. But just for example, Butte, Meade, Lawrence County had a tri-county drug task force. And law enforcement that were part of it were cross-deputized. So in other words, the problem that might have started in Spearfish, they didn't have to stop at the Spearfish city limits or the Lawrence County line. They could follow that criminal behavior across county lines. They also had
all the way around.
All the way around. They even had the DCI involved in these things. But a new thing that hasn't been done that could be utilized would be a Attorney General's strike force on methamphetamine, where you would get together talented and veteran prosecutors, and you would go into a community or an area of the state, and you would target and eliminate through prosecution those persons who are selling and profiting from this very destructive drug in our community. Mm-hmm. So that's what I would see. I think that you could also tell the legislators just what I told you about, the judges were the people who are best equipped to decide what kinds of sentences they should get as far as people who commit crimes. And they're just mandating across the board, people that are stealing, firearms, people that are committing burglary, people that, repeatedly don't get society's message and they drink and drive even after they've been convicted, should at least have the option of sending those people to the state penitentiary. And I think that's the deterrent. You want to keep people from breaking the law by letting them see that there are potential consequences. But now, across the board, when it's probation and then you violate probation, it's more probation because we just don't want to spend any money to put these people in the penitentiary.
And what do you say to the person who says, well, if you want to steal my gun, I'll let you steal just this one small piece of it?
No. Well, that's, you're right. I mean,
is there a castle doctrine in the state of South Dakota?
And what do you mean by that? Explain.
Defending your own home with the use of up to lethal force.
Well,
some states have it.
Sure. the laws of self-defense have to do with what is the reasonable and the necessary use of force. And so that's how I would best describe the use of force. If it's in your own home, you don't have a duty to retreat. So if somebody comes into your home, you don't have an added obligation to have to try to retreat. You can stand your ground in your own home and defend yourself or your family. So it's all fact specific, it would depend on the facts and the circumstances, but I think that's generally the answer.
Okay.
Reasonable and necessary use of force.
Just making sure as to where that law stood.
In summary, I would just say that, I am battle tested. I have done in excess of 250 jury trials. And when it comes to justice, I'm not somebody who's gonna back down. I'm, one of those older model lawyers where aggression and hostility comes as standard equipment. So I'd really like to have that job. Because I really think that I have an obligation with the level of experience and in this particular niche of being a prosecuting attorney for as long as I've done it. I have an obligation to at least offer my services to the state of South Dakota. Now, whether I get this job or not, that's not up to me, but I should offer my services to the state because there's never been anybody else who served this long as a state's attorney, an active state's attorney, who's ever run for this job. And I mean, I've been making decisions that affect public safety, in my setting as a state's attorney. And I've done this for a long period of time. And on a state level, I would just bring the skills and the services that I've rendered for Lawrence County to the state. And
Butte and Lawrence County.
yeah, Butte and Lawrence County, that's right. Yeah, I was up here for 15 years. I was the state's attorney here in Belfouche, and I loved doing it, and I've loved doing it up in Lawrence County. So that's what I'm doing it for.
Thank you, John.
Well, thank you.
Appreciate having you here. You're welcome anytime.
Thanks.
Okay. John Fitzgerald, candidate on the Republican side for Attorney General of the state of South Dakota. How many cold cases have you solved?
Well,
Can you describe a couple of them?
okay, number one, I would say that I have been involved in the prosecution of a cold case that was David Rose, who was murdered August 2nd of 1982 at Mount Roosevelt, which is outside of Deadwood. Now, solving it, that would be presumptuous of me to say that I solved it, because this really was a team effort amongst law enforcement, and it also involved the computer systems of the FBI. So I don't claim credit for it. I did successfully prosecute and convict that individual who had killed David Rose. But I wasn't solely responsible, of course, for that. I just was involved in the prosecution. But as I recall the facts, David Rose, who was from Belfouche at that time, had picked up a couple of hitchhikers, and he had taken the hitchhikers and they'd gone up to Mount Roosevelt to camp. And as best as could be determined, one of those individuals bludgeoned David Rose to death with a rock and then left his body at Mount Roosevelt. And that was in August of 1982. And what had happened was the presumed murderer had left a fingerprint on the David Rose's vehicle, and he'd also left some DNA in a cigarette butt that had been left at the campsite. And so it took a long period of time for basically the computer systems and technology in the FBI to catch up. But ultimately, they got a match on that fingerprint. And then when they got a match, they were able to find the individual who was responsible for it. And so he was prosecuted. We have another one that remains unsolved that I'm pretty familiar with, and that was on February 19th, 2000. Some young hunters, trappers, were out in the area north of the town of St. Ange, South Dakota. and they discovered the skeletal remains of an individual. And the individual was covered by two very large boards, so he wasn't that well covered, but he had been there for some period of time, nonetheless. So they took the body down, and it was the skeletal remains. There was still some skin and some clothing on it. They took the body down to Rapid City, and then they had a forensic pathologist examine the remains. And they found a number of bullets inside these human remains. And so it obviously was not a suicide because he'd been shot multiple times in different parts of his body. I think he was shot more than once. I think it was something like 4 or 5 times. And then, of course, the body had been covered by these large boards in an area north of St. Ange. It's like ranch area, so it's fairly remote, but maybe 100 yards off a gravel road. And so they had those remains analyzed by experts, and the best the experts could say was that that body had been there either 9 months or up to 3 years. And so exactly when that person was murdered is still not a known fact, but they got a range of it, so 99 to as late as 1997. And so now we're talking, it's been 20 plus years since then.
Any identification?
No, that's the mysterious part of it. So, of course, there's been pictures. They've had people try to recreate the image of what they thought this person would look like based upon what they had. There are websites where these unsolved murders are, and this one is listed too. But as of today, no one has ever identified who this person is. And so the starting point of any murder would be to try to figure out, well, who is this person? Who was he last with? Where was he last seen? Try to find out who would know who he was and where he had been and what happened to him.
So definitely a he.
Yeah, it's a male. Oh yeah, it's a male skeleton. And no, today it remains unsolved.
Unsolved.
Because we
As
haven't
the
even
missing person case in Belle Fourche
right.
remains unsolved.
And I think you're talking about Beverly.
Yes.
Yeah, Beverly. They never found a body, so that's even
Nothing. So this, as Attorney General, do you can start a cold case unit that would?
Well, I think that the state already has some sort of a cold case unit with the DCI, and so it's already in existence. But these cases are very difficult to solve because just the lack of information. Again, like with the St. Ange murder victim, you don't even have a starting point as to figuring out who he was. And Beverly Ozuna, you don't have a starting point because you have never found the remains. So,
or where she last was.
yes.
How do you get your car blown up?
Are you talking about my
Your father?
Well, it happened a long time ago, and I was
Yes. You were just
I was 12 years old, and my dad was working for clients who were connected with the mafia. And at some point, he crossed the mafia, and so the remedy for that type of a offense for them is murder. So they decided that they would kill him, and they hired some people to plant a bomb in his car. And so then he got off work, went out, started his car, and the bomb blew up. It blew off his right leg, and it maimed his left leg. He got metal and shrapnel all over his body. He was basically bleeding to death. The priest gave him his last rites. They didn't expect that he was gonna make it. And I was the oldest of 5 kids. I was only 12, and so my mom arranged for me to go to the hospital. And I think it was probably because they believed that he would not recover, and so they wanted me to basically say goodbye to my dad.
Yeah.
And so,
You made it.
he did make it. And so then he agreed to testify against the mafia. And in return, the Massachusetts State Police arrived at our house. And so my dad was in the hospital, but we had Massachusetts State Police officers lived basically in our driveway in rotating shifts. And so they guarded the family while he was in the hospital. And that's kind of how that story goes, you know. And then there was a good thing is that my dad got a second chance because he came to South Dakota.
Right.
And ultimately, when he passed away in 2001, he was a circuit court judge down in Rapid City.
Mm-hmm.
So it made me very determined.
Yes, I was going to ask that. Is this the type of thing that hardened you toward criminals?
Yes.
Yeah.
Makes me a strong believer in the appropriateness of the death penalty for certain crimes and for certain criminals.
Okay. So
you know, if you go on...
You do support the death penalty?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. You go on to Google right now. I believe that you, if you looked up, let's get the names right here. Frank Salemi. And you Google searched it right now, you'd see that he's on trial in Boston, Massachusetts for a murder that he's accused of committing in 1993, where they just unearthed the remains of a person that he'd killed. That's the man that was convicted of bombing my father. He's
still around?
Well, he's 84, and he's been in and out of prison, but they unearthed another body that he was involved in, and he's being prosecuted for another murder. And that's going on as we speak in Boston, Massachusetts. So these people are evil. They're psychopaths.
I was born and raised in New Jersey. They're psychopaths.
Yeah, they
are.
Don't understand how your actions can affect families, people. They don't have that ability to understand.
I think the opposite, unfortunately. They do. And they use it against you. Pro-life and family values, where do you stand there?
Well, I would be pro-life. I believe that when a child is conceived, it's a human life, and that we shouldn't be allowing, unelected, unaccountable judges to basically make decisions that should be left. That's not a decision that judges should be making.
Should it be left up to the mother or the parents?
I think that,
or is it
it's a
total
unique,
pro-life?
yeah, I think that a child, an unborn child, has, unique fingerprints, unique DNA, that is a human life, and that I spent my whole life as an adult trying to protect innocent people from, harm and prosecuting people that hurt innocent people, and I can't think of anything that's more innocent than an unborn baby. And so they really need to be afforded protections under the law.
So they are citizens.
Yes.
Law the rights of citizens.
Yes.
Second Amendment. Would you support open carry?
Yes. Yeah. I think that
I know our current governor doesn't.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but no, I do. You're talking about the constitutional right to carry.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I do support that. South Dakota has a unique history. I don't know if you recall that we were had a constitutional right to drive in South Dakota. And if you talk to some of the really older folks in our state, that they're in their 80s, they'll tell you that there was a time in South Dakota that you didn't need a driver's license to drive. And that came about, I believe, in around the 1950s or so.
Mm-hmm.
We then became a state that had a driver's license. But prior to that period of time, there was basically a constitutional right to drive a car in South Dakota. And that's probably the reason why we still have people are allowed to drive in South Dakota at age 14.
Yes.
Is because of the fact that we used to allow people to drive that didn't have a driver's license. And so, the constitutional right to carry, certainly that would be appropriate. They do it in Arizona. That's a much larger populated state, and they don't seem to have any more problem. So I think that, yeah, unless you're disqualified from having a firearm concealed, like a felony conviction, then there isn't any reason why people can't carry firearms.
Would it matter which kind of felony?
Well,
there's murder,
Yeah.
there's tax evasion.
Sure.
Yeah.
There are differences, and there are the passage of time, but there'd probably be certain disqualifying felonies, like for violent crime. It
Yes.
probably should disqualify you.
beating your wife or something like that
Sure.
should disqualify.
Yeah.
I would
Violent
say.
crimes.
Repeat drug offenders and traffickers. Should the traffickers be dealt with more harshly than the repeat offenders?
Well, yes, and I think it depends on how much they're trafficking. I think that the quantities that are being trafficked play a role in how long the sentences should be. You start talking about this fentanyl analog. Apparently, just a few grains of salt, or the amount of fentanyl analog that would equal a few grains of salt, can be deadly. And so it can't be completely based upon the quantity, but quantity should play a role. Somebody who is trafficking in pounds of methamphetamine, pounds of heroin, should obviously receive long penitentiary sentences, whether it's in state court or it's in the federal system. That's different than somebody who's involved and is giving their friend, that's a distribution under a law, giving a friend small amounts of these drugs. That's still distribution, but it's a different scale, so it should have a different type of punishment.
Colorado
Yep.
is legal for marijuana. If someone is traveling from Colorado to go visit Mount Rushmore and they get caught with a little bit of marijuana, what should the punishment be?
It should be the same as it would be for somebody from South Dakota. I mean, our laws apply to anybody who's in our state. Because you come from Colorado, where they've authorized marijuana, doesn't give you a right to come into our state and break our laws. So until our laws are changed, the laws that we have need to be enforced. Part of what happened in Colorado and some of the other states is that really in violation of the supremacy clause of the United States Constitution, these states have been allowed to authorize the marijuana sales in their states, because marijuana, by federal law, the Controlled Substance Act, is illegal. And so
Yes.
the states don't have the right to basically ignore federal laws. That's the supremacy clause of the United States Constitution that says when the federal government has regulated a subject matter, then their laws are supreme. And so these states have basically just ignored the federal law and done what they wanted. And so what should happen is that the federal government should make a decision as to whether or not they want to change the marijuana laws or allow states to authorize or legalize it, but not for the states to just go off on their own and ignore the federal law. But that's what we have. It's completely unregulated, Carl. Not only are we flooded with marijuana, but an even bigger problem is we're flooded with these extractions that are made from marijuana. They call them different things. Oils. Basically what they use is they use solvents. Butane, hexane, propane. They can use
all the
alcohol.
stuff that's good for you.
And they pour it through, and it takes away the part through the use of solvents. It just extracts the THC, the stuff that gets you high. And then they make it in wax, and they smoke it, they inject it into candies, all sorts of things. This is stuff that's like, 10, 20 times stronger than marijuana, completely unregulated. There's no FDA checking the substances, and so they've got some of the residual propane, hexane, methane that are used as the solvents still in the products. And we are flooded with that stuff because you go down to Colorado and buy all these extractions, and so they're all over the country.
I have a South Dakota driver's license. I'm allowed to drive anywhere in this United States. I have a South Dakota gun permit. I am not allowed to carry that gun anywhere in these United States. One is a privilege, one is a right. Why is my right being denied? Can you answer that?
Well, again, against the backdrop of marijuana, it's a little bit different discussion.
Oh, it is a different discussion, I know that. But it was one of these things that has always bothered me. A legal explanation of how a state can accept a privilege. By law, they have to accept this privilege of driving, but they don't have to accept my constitutional right.
Well, I think if I was going to answer it, I would say that, under the 9th and 10th Amendment, those rights that are not expressly taken by the federal government are reserved to the states and to the people. And so the states have the right to regulate firearms to some degree in their own states. And so these privileges or the rights to carry weapons can be subject to different laws in different states.
So those amendments abrogate the second.
Well, I don't think that they abrogate it, but they allow states a certain type of ability to make laws regarding firearms in their own states that may be unique from other states. That's the best answer I can give to that.
Okay, then I was just asking. I wanted the answer. Never said I was gonna like it, but that's like when you pray to the Lord, you may not like the answer, but He's gonna answer your prayer.
That's right.
State Senator Bob Ewing had some nice things to say about you. I wanted to let the folks know. He wrote a letter where he said John never once asked for a raise for himself or for any additional staff unless it was absolutely necessary. You run a tight ship.
Right, I do. I'm a taxpayer, so.
A fiscally tight ship.
Right.
Ewing witnessed him in the courtroom during rape, murder, and drug distribution cases. John's been involved with the prosecution of over 250 jury trials, and he said, "We have no reason to settle for less when we have the best man for the job." So that's how other people think of you.
Well, it's very kind.
And
I have had a lot of jury trials, a lot of experience in the courtroom, and I would bring that to the office of the Attorney General. It would be a privilege to serve in that office, and I think that the trial experience is an important facet of it. I think if you added up, there's 5 people in our state right now running for Attorney General, and if you added up all of the jury trial experience of all the other 4 candidates, that's both Democrat and Republican.
they don't equal yours alone.
Well, if you take their jury trials times 2, then I don't think you would even equal what I've done.
Okay.
Because Randy Seiler's the only one that's actually put forth how many jury trials he's had, and he says he's had 70.
And they're pretty much all on the federal level, aren't they?
Yes, they are. Yeah. Well, he's a state prosecutor too.
Oh.
He's done 70 jury trials.
Okay.
But yeah, that's what I would say. So add all 4 of the people running for Attorney General from both parties and took the number of jury trials they tried and then took it times 2, you still wouldn't equal the amount of jury trials that I've had. And that's what happens when you've been a prosecuting attorney, for 38 years in the smaller and the medium-sized counties. I've been the state's attorney here in Butte County and the state's attorney in Lawrence County. I really do know what this job is about. And you really need to be able to assist and mentor state's attorneys in our states, whether they come from the bigger or the smaller or the medium-sized populated areas. This is a difficult job to be a state's attorney, and they can use all the help they can get from the Attorney General's office. And unless you walk the walk and talk the talk, it's pretty hard to really help them out. The same goes for law enforcement. Law enforcement is a very difficult job, getting more complicated all the time. It'd be nice to have an Attorney General in that office that's done it for decades, knows exactly what those people go through.
I was a city policeman in Bellefuche for 2 years. I don't want to do it again. It's become that rough a job. It's not fun.
And God forbid that a law enforcement officer ever had to shoot somebody. But if that happened, you'd want an Attorney General making the calls in those kinds of situations that knew what the rules
right
are.
Wrong.
Yeah. On politics, but based upon the facts.
As a longtime attorney and one who has worked for the prosecution, John, you claim that you are tough but fair. One of the big problems that has come up recently is corruption in South Dakota government. Several people dead, others ruined for life. EV5, Gear Up, you name it. Are we sweeping some of this under the rug, or are we bringing it out?
Well, I guess the answer is.
I'm not saying to say anything against Marty Jackley either.
And I would just say that, okay, so I've been a state's attorney and a lawyer for 38 years as a prosecutor, 39 years as a lawyer. I don't know what challenges we'll face in the future, but that type of experience gives me a solid foundation in facing whatever challenges come our way as a state. And you've named challenges that have faced our state in the past, but I guarantee you, Carl, we'll have the same challenges next year or in the next 5 years, if not worse challenges. And so, again, I'm not dodging anything here, but every one of those cases that you've mentioned is fact specific. And so it is something that you have to be completely familiar with the facts about before you start commenting about what went on. And so I don't have that familiarity with those facts. I can tell you about the last rape case I tried and all the nuances, or I can tell you about some old
gory details, but we don't
some
want
old
to hear.
murder. But those are fact specifics, and I'm just saying that what you have to do is you have to be able to meet those challenges. They're fact specific, so you have to know exactly what the facts are, but you have to leave the public satisfied that whatever happened, that the right decisions were made. And so a lot of times there needs to be a disclosure of certain facts when money is alleged to be stolen from the taxpayers. Then the taxpayers need to know what ultimately occurred as far as the investigation. What are the true facts? Those are the kinds of things that need to be disclosed when anything like that happens in our state.
Tribal governments. How can the Attorney General work? It's a myriad of, you name it, agreements and treaties and all that. But how can the state work better with the tribes? Or is it possible?
Well, you're right. There's a myriad of different rules. The major crimes that occur on the Indian reservation are prosecuted by the federal prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office. The BIA has jurisdiction over certain crimes, and the state, it depends on which reservation you're talking about and where the crimes occurred, because some of these jurisdictions are somewhat checkerboarded. And so it is a complicated situation when you deal with the tribes. And there's plenty of state's attorneys that operate and are the state's attorneys in these adjoining counties. Some of the state's attorneys actually have a Indian reservation as an attached portion of their jurisdiction as state's attorneys. So to tell you frankly, I would be relying on those state's attorneys in those areas for a lot of the expertise, and then the people from the Attorney General's office that deal with these issues on a regular basis. I'm sort of just like a trial lawyer. That's what my main skill set is. And so I know enough that I need to rely on those people who have some expertise in there before I delve into an area that is not something that I have dealt with. I have dealt with rapes, robberies, kidnappings, murders, drugs, drunk driving,
all the good stuff,
all the crimes. That's what I've done. So that's my area of expertise. And so I know at my age that there are areas that I need to rely on other people for. I don't have all the answers.
Kristi Noem has mentioned the need for more transparency in South Dakota government and state, county, and municipal levels. What's your stance on promoting transparency and accountability in the Attorney General's office?
Well, I would support that.
I know there's some things that obviously have to be kept secret.
That's right. Ongoing criminal investigations, you can't
you don't want to
those.
slather someone's name who's totally innocent.
That's right. And
that's what let someone go once they realize, oh, they're looking for me.
That's right.
Adios.
That's right.
Costa Rica, here I come.
That's right. So there does need to be transparency, but you also have to weigh in the importance of criminal investigations. And as you pointed out, sometimes people are in fact innocent, and false accusations can be made. So you can't just let all this information out without understanding what it is and making some judgment calls about whether or not there is evidence here to pursue a prosecution or not. So otherwise, you just damage innocent people, and that's part of the job of the attorney.
And the trial
not to do.
is to determine
Yes,
innocence or guilt.
that's right.
In the recent Republican primary debate on public broadcasting for the House Representative position, Chantel Krebs mentioned the success of the school Sentinel program, but Neil Tapio noted it has approximately 2 schools involved. Attorney General Marty Jackley confirmed the next school Sentinel training program scheduled for July 30th through August 10th of this year at the Law Enforcement Training Academy in Pierre. What is your opinion on the school Sentinel program?
I think it's a good idea. I think that they need to do everything that they can to protect children from harm, and perhaps metal detectors, perhaps arming, some of these teachers that are trained in firearms is a good step in the right direction.
Trained, qualified, and
Yes.
and willing.
Right.
Because I remember when I was a cop here, seeing rifles in the back of pickups in the high school parking lot. No biggie.
Right.
They were just there.
Things have changed.
Things have changed. Now a kid leaves a bullet in the trunk and he's suspended for a week.
Right.
You know how the Attorney General's office works currently.
Right.
How would you change it? What would you change?
Well, I would just try to offer up my services